per reports, the Pittsburgh Steelers are looking to trade for a wide receiver. So, Adam Schefter, he went on ESPN's Pat McAfee show to say that the trade deadline is in 3 weeks. He expects some major trades to happen this week because the Steelers are looking for a wide receiver and the Chargers are looking for a running back. But the Pittsburgh Steelers are being active, making some trade calls and seeing what the market is. But first, before I get more into it and who the Steelers might trade for, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn notifications for everything Pittsburgh Steelers news and updates. Also like this video. Now let's get right into it. So the Pittsburgh Steelers are dealing with an injury to wide receiver Calvin Austin and his shoulder, and he has missed this past week's game. But other than DK Metcalf at the Steelers wide receiver spot, the Steelers really don't have much depth at that position or much superstar talent, because the next player in line is Scotty Miller. Scotty Miller, he just received the second most wide receiver reps in this past week's game against the Cleveland Browns. And then other than that, they have Roman Wilson, who barely plays. They have Skornick, who barely plays. So the Pittsburgh Steelers might need a wide receiver other than DK Metcalf and Calvin Austin to perform well this season. There was a stat that went in this past week's game saying going into the game, there's only one player on the active roster at the wide receiver spot who had more than one catch, and that was DK Metcalf. So every other wide receiver on the roster had less than 2 catches. Obviously, Calvin Austin was injured, so he doesn't include in that statistic, but having that limited wide receiver depth is a concern. And that is why the Pittsburgh Steelers are interested in the wide receiver market. So, when looking at the outside receivers and who may be available, well, there was obviously talks this offseason about the Pittsburgh Steelers calling the New Orleans Saints for wide receiver Chris Olave. They were kind of turned down, but as the Saints' record is getting worse and worse, maybe they look to trade wide receiver Chris Olave. Maybe that trade becomes more of a possibility. So that's someone to keep an eye on. And also, last week, there was a report going along that Rashid Shaheed is in the last year of his contract and that he's likely to get dealt before this deadline. And there was a report going along that the Pittsburgh Steelers actually contacted the Saints once again, but this time for wide receiver Rashid Shaheed, not Chris Olave. So maybe that's a player who the Pittsburgh Steelers keep an eye on as well, determining on what the Saints do. You look at those two players, obviously Chris Olave is the better receiver and probably the one that you would want, but Rashid Shaheed is a deep threat and the speedster who could do punt returns, kick returns, and obviously be the deep threat. He doesn't really get much targets, but when he does, he puts up yards and stats. So that's someone to keep an eye on. And then, obviously, you look at A.J. Brown. The Pittsburgh Steelers might be interested in him because of the Arthur Smith connection. They're both in Tennessee together. And then you look at the other thing in which DK Metcalf played with A.J. Brown in college. So those two are going to be friendly in terms of, hey, if you get more targets, I'm fine with it because I'm used to that. I'm used to you being my teammate. So it's better. Obviously, A.J. Brown isn't happy with the Eagles losing games, isn't happy with the Eagles not giving him enough targets, and you see him getting mad in Philadelphia. And he may want out shortly. And the Eagles may look to trade him because if they could get a draft pick for him, or maybe use him to get a different piece that they need, like their edge rusher just retired. Maybe they need an edge rusher. Maybe they need something else. So the Pittsburgh Steelers, they may be willing to trade for A.J. Brown because of those connections and because they need another wide receiver. And it seems like they want to become more physical at the wide receiver spot. And which better player to get in terms of physicality than DK Metcalf and A.J. Brown? 2 beasts. So that's another player to keep an eye on in terms of if he becomes available, the Pittsburgh Steelers might pounce on that idea of pairing those two together once again. And having those two big wide receivers with Calvin Austin in the slot, that could be dangerous. So the Pittsburgh Steelers, in terms of other players they might keep an eye on, there's an obvious one, and that's Jakobi Meyers. Jakobi Meyers, he kind of requested a trade this offseason because he couldn't get a contract completed with the Raiders. The Raiders' record is terrible, and if we're being honest, they should probably just rebuild. They don't have a good quarterback. They don't have really good wide receivers. So may as well trade your good guy at wide receiver and see what you could get back for him and start building over. Because obviously your team isn't going anywhere. Jakobi Meyers is a player who's a pure route runner. He's good. He's getting up there in age. He's now at 30 plus. Me personally, there's better options, I believe, than Jakobi Meyers. But if you're looking for a short-term answer at that spot, maybe he becomes available. Here to requested a trade, maybe the Raiders grant his wishes and trade him for a draft pick or a player. So those are the most obvious ones, but now I'm going to list the wide receivers who may be available for trade, who more than likely the Pittsburgh Steelers wouldn't be targeting, or we don't know for sure if they would be traded. For example, DJ Moore. It seems like the Chicago Bears are kind of gauging the interest in the market for him to see what he would go with. Because you have Rome Odunze now at the wide receiver spot for the Bears. DJ Moore doesn't get as much targets, so maybe they're more willing to trade him. And you look at a different team in Tennessee Titans. You look at Calvin Ridley. He's a player as well who just got a big contract. He's coming down in terms of not producing this season, so maybe he's available for the trade market as well. You look at other players like A.D. Mitchell. You look at Tim Patrick. You look at some outside players who may become available because their team is not good or there's no use for that player on that team anymore. So those players may become available, and who knows, the Pittsburgh Steelers might gauge the interest in them. Those are just the wide receivers who have become available on the trade market here recently. Another player is Devontae Smith. Obviously, him and A.J. Brown go hand to hand with not liking their situation in the Eagles wide receiver room right now. But I think A.J. Brown would be the person you would trade before Devontae Smith for some reason. Even though I do believe A.J. Brown's the better wide receiver, for some reason I just believe that they would keep Devontae Smith. And then the most obvious one, if you are a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, you look at all those trade options, and most of those guys would be great to have on this team. But the one player who's you keep having stuck in your mind is Allen Lazard. Even though, me personally, I would not want the Steelers to trade for him, I would be disappointed if the Steelers traded for him because there's other wide receivers I'd rather give a chance to. I'd rather Roman Wilson have a better chance to produce more than just give it to Allen Lazard. But Allen Lazard's name keeps coming up because of that link to Aaron Rodgers and the comfort that Aaron Rodgers would have in him. Being Allen Lazard played with Aaron Rodgers with the Packers, the Jets, and that connection that they have on the field together. Obviously, that connection would be good here in Pittsburgh, but I would rather just target a different wide receiver and not just go with the player that you're used to because you're used to him. I'd rather go for the better players, and there's way more available than Allen Lazard. But Allen Lazard's name keeps coming up when you hear about the trade talks because of those connections to Aaron Rodgers. So, even though I'd rather all those other wide receivers, I just think it might be Allen Lazard at the very end of the day. And that may take the least amount of draft compensation to get a player like him too. But is he really better if you give Roman Wilson a full-time shot? Is he really better than Kelvin Austin if you want to move him to wide receiver number 2? I just don't know for sure if that's the case. But anyway, those are the wide receivers who have become available on the trade market. Those are the top wide receivers who the Pittsburgh Steelers have attempted to trade for already, have called about, or may be interested in because of those little connections here and there. Anyway, that is the end of this video, but we know one thing for certain. The Pittsburgh Steelers are interested in adding a wide receiver at the deadline. And the one thing that I would say is we don't know if it's going to be for a player swap or if it's going to be for draft compensation. Because you have to think, the Pittsburgh Steelers gave away a third-round draft pick, or gained a third-round draft pick for wide receiver George Pickens. So the most they would probably want to give up is that third-round draft pick back for a top-tier wide receiver. But at the same time, the Pittsburgh Steelers didn't trade draft picks for Jalen Ramsey and Jonnu Smith. They did a player swap. So maybe because the draft is in Pittsburgh, the Steelers don't want to trade draft picks. They want to keep those draft picks because it's in Pittsburgh and they want as much draft picks as possible to either make trades, move up, or stay still and pick a lot. So we have to be interested to see what the Pittsburgh Steelers do. Do they use draft picks to trade, or do they do player swaps? We'll have to wait to see what happens before the trade deadline. And one last thing I'll say is people hate that the Steelers trade away George Pickens. Me, I do too. I believe he could have been a really good wide receiver with Aaron Rodgers, but they got a third-round pick back for him, and now they're interested in the wide receiver market because they don't have George Pickens. So if they would have just kept him, this would all be solved. Anyway, that is the end of this video, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below on the Steelers being interested in a wide receiver, and who should they target, and who do you think they'll get? So who do you want, and who do you think? And also, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn notifications for everything Pittsburgh Steelers news, updates, highlights, analysis reports, everything surrounding this team. I have you covered all season long, even with trade news like this and more stuff. So like, comment, subscribe, turn notifications, share the video, and until the next video tomorrow, that's it for me. I'll see you guys all later. I'm out. Peace.